So yeah, thanks so much for joining everyone. I'm Anna, I coordinate WEAll Read, and I'm really thrilled that you have decided to spend what, at least for me, is a very sunny evening anyway. So thanks for coming online, even on a sunny evening, if it is sunny where you are. Um, so I'm a sustainability consultant and activist. I set up WEAll Read a couple of years ago. I'm queer, was born in Scotland. I'm now living in London. And for anyone who might be low vision, I'm blonde wearing a blue t-shirt. I'm lucky enough to have come from a secure and loving home, and therefore to have had the privilege to turn my attention to this big picture economic thinking. And while it's becoming increasingly common practice in North America, some of you might have noticed, to acknowledge the land on which we live at the start of certain meetings, I'd really like to take a moment to acknowledge Britain's involvement in widespread suffering throughout the world, both in the past and in the present. So here's to a fruitful and meaningful discussion, and to the well-being of our elders and ecosystems, past, present, emerging, and future. So it would be great if you could put your name in the chat, where you're dialing in from, and perhaps a sentence about what brought you here today. Amanda, who I'll introduce properly shortly, is going to give us a bit of a refresher of the key content of the Wellbeing Economy Guide, and then we'll go into some breakout rooms briefly, come together for broader discussion. And what I'm going to try out for the first time is just keeping the Zoom open for an extra 15 or 20 minutes after we kind of formally finish at 8:45, just because people expressed after the last time we had a session that they wanted a little bit more time to kind of digest and mull over the ideas. So we'll try that for the first time. Anyway, so we're lucky enough to have Amanda Janoo with us this evening. So thanks so much, Amanda. Amanda is the WEAll Knowledge and Policy Lead and the main author who brought together, I think, about 70 different people for input into this guide. So it was very much co-created, but spearheaded by Amanda, who has about a decade's worth of experience in industrial policy, has worked for the UN, the African Development Bank, and she really, through her work, aims to build just and sustainable economies and everything that I think WEAll really stands for. So WEAll is really lucky to have you, Amanda, and we're very lucky to have you for this next hour and a bit. So yeah, over to you.
Oh, well, thank you so much, Anna. I just want to say how excited I am to be here. It was very synchronistic, actually, because I was thinking about how I wanted to join a book club, and I was like, I should join WEAll Reads, and I joined your WhatsApp group just maybe a week or something before Anna reached out, and she's like, "Would you want to do the policy design guide for WEAll Reads?" I was like, "Absolutely! This is a great sort of opportunity to get to meet all of you, share a little bit, and also hear your thoughts as well." So what I thought I would do is to just give a little presentation which sort of summarizes some of the key ideas that are in the guide, sort of the structure, content, that sort of bit for anybody who wasn't able to maybe go through it, but also give it a little bit more of some of like the underlying philosophical questions or economic questions or things like that that underpin some of the ideas that are within the guide as well. And then, as Anna said, bring a question to you all to discuss and deliberate on before we have a group discussion on it. So I'm really looking forward to that. I'm going to share my screen. Now, can everybody see this? Yeah? Okay, perfect. All right. So the idea with the policy design guide actually was oftentimes, and I think within the movement, there are so many incredible members that we have that have really great ideas of what kind of policies or definitions or conceptions of what a well-being economy would look like. So a lot of the what and then a little less of the how. And so particularly for policymakers, I think what we're really yearning for as communities and as policymakers ourselves within democratic societies is a better understanding of how we practically move beyond our current economic system in a way that is really democratic and participatory, and to really help to start to support and institutionalize a new way of thinking and managing the economy so that we can achieve well-being for our people and planet. And so throughout the guide, you'll see quotes like this one, which is from Till, from members who contributed to the development of this guide, either as part of the drafting team or workshops or reviewers or country counterparts from the hub. So that's one of really the lovely parts of the guide for me, are these quotes throughout. And so with that in mind, at the beginning, we spent quite a lot of time thinking about the principles. What are the principles that really need to underpin the way we would design policies for a well-being economy? We ultimately ended up identifying 7, and I won't speak to all of them, but I think there's a couple that I think are really, really important and quite transformative. And the first one, of course, is kind of the goal orientation. It's about a different goal of economic policy and policy making in general, where its starting point is the well-being of people and planet. And in addition to that, really importantly, contextual. So one of the challenges with contemporary economic thinking is that it's really one size fits all. It assumes that across all space and time, all people act in the same way and on the basis of the same motivations. But the reality is that, if we understand that we're the economy and that it's a reflection of us and our culture and our societies, our histories, our resources, then a well-being economy is going to look different in different places, as will also the journey by which people get there. And so acknowledging and making space for that contextual and place-based approach was really important in this guide. Similarly, participation, was really central at the heart of this guide, recognizing the need for people to really be the agents of change, to have a voice in the decisions that impact their lives, to really revitalize economic democracy and have that be the driver for a well-being economy. And finally, the strength-based approach, I think, is maybe the one that's the hardest, I think, for policymakers and to really fully embrace, because a lot of times we design policies and we see the role of government as being here to just fix the problems and the crises that we have, as opposed to really beginning with what is our vision for the better world we want, and what are the existing strengths and capacities we have, the things that we know are going well, and how can we build upon those as the ways in which to achieve well-being for now and for generations to come. And so with that, we thought, okay, well, what does this mean in practice? And one of the challenges with writing, obviously, is that we write in linear sort of structures. And so when writing something like this, which is a guide, we wanted to break it up in a way that could make sense for policymakers. So it's kind of structured around the idea of a policy design cycle. But the reality is that it's not a step-by-step process. There's constant intersection between all of these different activities and feedback loops and iterations. And so whilst it's laid out in sort of a chronological seeming order, that's not really the way that it's meant to be applied in the end, that you can use bits and pieces in different ways and come back and feed forth. And so with that, we started with the first question, which I think is really at the heart of how do we develop and internalize a new definition of progress, right? Because it's not just an issue of GDP at the national level that we assume that the indicators of success are wealth. It's also seeped into our cultures, into our own understandings of success, that, we will be successful and we will if we've achieved wealth. And so in thinking about transforming that understanding of progress and really moving from wealth to well-being as the orientation point, we wanted to think about what are different processes that can help to achieve that. And so the first one, and this is an example of the sort of the structure of the guide, was how do we understand what matters for well-being? And within this guide, along with the contextual, sort of approach, we have these hows, and we outline a variety of different approaches. We recognize there's going to be different approaches and linked to tools that policymakers or citizens can use to help them to operationalize that. But importantly, there's also the WEAll tips. And this is where the membership really bring forth their suggestions and ideas of how to do this properly. And so from, WEAll, or at least this guide's perspective, the best way to understand what matters for well-being is to ask people, because the process of asking people and having they themselves reflect on the things that truly matter for their well-being now and for generations to come makes them also internalize that recognition that it's not wealth, right? It might be housing security and access to nature and sense of respect and status and a variety of different kinds of factors. But once we realize that that's what we actually want, then we start to internalize and be able to articulate a different vision of progress. And the communication part is the sort of a next aspect that we speak to in the guide. And that's something which I think is so huge, because you can have oftentimes within policy documents, governments stating a certain goal or ambition. But if people in society don't feel that that's resonating with them, that they don't own that themselves, and they can't see and really understand that new conception of progress, then it's difficult, right? It's difficult to really make sure that you have the movement behind and the support for the transformation ahead. And so thinking about this, different governments use different ways. Infographics, I think visual representations like paintings can be really powerful. I hope that we'll have more music that's really illustrative of these kind of visions moving forward, as well as more people engage. Then finally, of course, I think within our own movement, we see a lot of energy around the question of how we measure this. So what are the alternative indicators to GDP or to the economic indicators we're using right now to evaluate our progress? And what's important, maybe as an emphasis is that this guide doesn't say what indicators to use. It really focuses more on how do you select those indicators, right? And so this example from Wales, I always really love, because when they were creating their sort of well-being framework and the indicators they wanted to use, the emphasis on these indicators being intuitive was huge, right? That people actually understood what these indicators meant to them, and that the changes in them would be obvious to people, and that all people could understand and grasp this indicator in some way. And so thinking about principles like that as we shift from a concept that we know is important to well-being to really measuring that is a focus in this guide. The next section is sort of where we move, and I think where there's a lot of countries are stuck, right? They have the alternative indicators, they might have statements around well-being, but how do we really translate that into a different economic strategy? And so for us, within one of the fundamental underpinning questions here is, how do we expand our understanding of what the economy is and can be, right? Because really since the beginnings of some political economy and economics, the purpose of the economy has been viewed as to generate wealth, right? And as we move from a focus on wealth as the goal to well-being as the goal, how do we really conceptualize of an economy and build an economy and build a strategy to develop an economy that is a generator of well-being? And so a starting point for this, there's obviously going to be a lot of different relevant sort of activities, but was how do we identify well-being economic activities and behaviors, for example? Because we've for a long time focused on big businesses, big banks, big investors as the drivers of the economy because they're the most efficient generators of wealth, right? But are they the most efficient generators of well-being? No, right? And so as you move that and you ask people questions like, what's been provided to you in the last week that was really important to your well-being? You start to be able to expand your conception of monetized or non-monetized activities or behaviors from people and planet that are really critical. And then you think about how can we really foster and promote those in order to build a well-being economy? So again, coming back to that sort of strength-based approach. The second thing was around aligning institutions and stakeholders. I think this is where we're seeing a ton of really exciting initiatives where governments around the world are recognizing that the siloed approach to policy design and strategy design is just not cutting it, right? We want to move into much more holistic, systemic, interconnected approaches to designing strategies and thinking about policy design. And so there's a lot of great examples of this at the national level, at the sub-national level. For example, the Envision Utah, bringing in not only a wide variety of governments, but also the stakeholders within society, business, NGOs, community organizations, etc. And then we speak a bit to this, and this is a really tricky one, but a really important one, which is around trade-offs and power dynamics. So power dynamics is something that's not spoken about in economics really explicitly a lot of the time, but really that is what we're speaking to. And so when we consider the existing power imbalances and also recognize that particularly in certain timeframes, it's not going to be possible to achieve all of the same things in the same way, how do we ensure this transition and the achievement of this strategy in a way that feels just and fair and also acknowledges, and rebalances power within a society? And so then from here we have a section which is on assessing and selecting well-being economy policies. And the fundamental underlying question here actually is, how do we design policies to change the system, right? To really transform the holistic way in which the system is working. Because right now, one of the issues is that we very much often develop individual policies in silos for specific areas. And we don't necessarily see that this needs to be an emergent and interconnected and holistic. It's about the suite of policies. And so within this guide, we recommend, and this is a space where there's a lot of innovation still needed, but to really begin with first looking at what's in place, because the policies that are in place are what are maintaining the status quo, right? Like they are the rules and the incentives and the tax systems and all of these things that maintain and encourage certain kinds of activities relative to others. And so in order to realign, right, and change the system, we need to reform those existing policies to better align with our well-being objectives before even getting into the point of thinking about what kind of new policies we might want. And then when we think about new policies, how do we make sure that we develop these in a way that's really co-created by our society, by a wide range of actors. And so there's a lot of exciting examples like with digital platforms, but also community forums, citizen assemblies, etc. in this area. And then the fourth section is on implementing well-being economy policies. And this is where we're trying to shift, right? Like, so policy making is historically very top down. Yeah, it's like you have somebody, a minister, a president, whatever, they have certain directives and it flows down. And the major issue you hear all of the time is when it comes to implementation. Because what you developed in theory and your strategy, your policy documents all sounds great, but the people who are actually going to implement this and be affected by this were not engaged in it. So they don't really understand the logic. What happens in reality is very different from what ends up being planned. And so how do we flip this, right? How do we really try to foster up bottom-up sort of policy making, and as a way of also revitalizing economic democracy? And so within this guide, we talk about ways to really empower localized policy implementation and monitoring, so you can make sure that the communities are really the drivers of these initiatives and their implementation, and also adapting them along the way when they realize that additional things are needed to supplement this initiative, or that there's certain failures that have happened that they didn't expect. And so to create that ownership, so that people really see themselves as the creators of this well-being economy. And then the final sort of section I'll mention before handing it back to you is about evaluating policy impacts. And so this is really about how can we continuously learn and adapt on our journey towards a well-being economy, right? How can we learn from our experiences and the evidence in order to ensure that we're headed to where we want to go and figures out what works and what doesn't for our context. And so seeing, new ways of using assessments, right? Assessing well-being as a starting point to better understand interconnections with the system. But importantly, and I think this is really the most vital point, is how do policymakers are often very afraid to acknowledge failures, yeah, which makes them very risk adverse. And so how do we generate a culture where we all feel like we're part of this experiment, that we're all policymakers, so we can really embrace a culture of experimentation, of looking at best practice, of looking at lessons learned, and to try to figure out, okay, well, maybe that didn't work, but actually there's a lot of learning and magic to come from the most friction and the most difficult parts. And so that was kind of a quick summary of the policy design guide for you. And as WEAll reads, I'm really excited to actually hear from you and, what are the key takeaways you sort of had from the guide, both positive or negative, when you were reading it, when you were exploring it, as you heard some of my sort of key takeaways that I would share.
Thanks so much, Amanda. That was great. And I think, what's been so nice, in a couple of conversations I've had with Amanda just preparing for this, is that she said, well, I really want to hear what everyone else has to say. So, and that's so refreshing coming from, from a speaker. So thanks for nudging us towards that, Amanda. So we, thanks, Marek, for coming. And we'll be recording it. So we had a bit of a technical hitch before the call, which means that I've unfortunately not enabled breakout rooms. But what I'm going to do is put in the chat a link to a mural, which is, for anyone who's not used it before, it's like an online whiteboard. And then what I'd really like everybody to have a bit of a think about is exactly that question that Amanda just highlighted on your last slide. What were your key takeaways? Now that you've kind of had your memory jogged, or an introduction if you didn't manage to read the guide, have a think about what really excites you about the Wellbeing Economy Policy Guide. And then also maybe, you know, what were you less convinced by? What did you think, well, how would that actually work? Or I maybe disagree with that. Because it's really important. I think what we find really important at the book club is not to feel like we end up in this echo chamber of agreeing with each other all the time. So please feel free to be as provocative as you like. If you make sure you, I was going to say, click on the mural before going into the breakout room, so that's fine. So take a few minutes to play around with the post-its. You should be able to log in without like needing to write your name or anything. And you can just copy and paste the yellow post-its, jot some ideas down. And maybe if anyone has any burning questions, then you could shout out to Amanda. But if not, we can actually just take a couple of minutes to kind of digest and start writing down a few ideas. To get comfortable with silence for a couple of minutes. I think that's okay. Hi, Donya. Did you just drop out and then manage to get back in? Donya, I'm not sure if you heard what we were just saying. So let me repost it. We're just putting a few ideas into a mural, like an online whiteboard, if you would like to join. So I've just put the link into the chat in case you can't see it. Everybody being far too nice at the moment. You need to head over to the right-hand side. So I think what we'll do, we'll probably keep going maybe until 8 o'clock, so another 3 minutes, and then we'll kind of come together and have a little discussion. Does anyone struggle to get into the actual link? Is everybody okay? Assuming everyone's okay. So feel free to keep adding as thoughts appear. Catherine, I can see that you've written down a few things and you've said that you have to dash off. So I'm not sure if you want to maybe choose one to elaborate on.
Oh yeah. Let me think.
I like experimentation and evidence-based work. I mean, if you want to elaborate on that one, that would get my vote.
Yeah, okay, go for it then. Yeah, Amanda, I was just wondering about, in order, because at first glance there's potentially a tension between the two. I suspect I know what you're getting at in terms of learning from experimentation, but I also think that's quite a profound challenge to policymakers in terms of what counts as evidence, in terms of whose evidence is cherished and given kudos and so on. And so I'm just wondering about how that hits the road. And Anna, if I can sneak in another one. I know, Amanda, you've been taking this work forward with policymakers from around the world. And I'm just wondering, are there any patterns in what topics they're working on, their level of seniority, their training? Are they all economists, or are they all the rogue, I don't know, anthropologists who snuck into government? So like any patterns around the ones who are picking this up, and any conspicuous examples? And then, yeah, my apologies to everyone for having to leave early.
No, that's great. Sorry, I've just screen shared for the benefit of people who watch this in retrospect. But yeah, Amanda, do you want to add anything?
Sure, absolutely. Yeah, no, those are both like amazing sort of and really important kind of questions. I mean, it is like I worked for a long time supporting governments to do more data analysis, to have more evidence-based decision making, because there is a need, right, to ground decision making in reality and understandings of trends and relative performance over time. I think obviously the challenge is, and this is part of where, how we develop indicators and for what is really important, because as you say, oftentimes the things we end up measuring are things that are very outcomes oriented, right? So there might be, when you ask people what matters for well-being, like there are certain things that are really tangible and outcomes oriented. Let's say like work-life balance, ideally, not even all people do this, right? Or like certain numbers of goods, or like these number of jobs, or that sort of thing. But then there's also, people really care a lot about process, right? So like how transparent, like how engaged, like these sort of things that are maybe slightly harder to measure. And then the hardest ones are the values that they discuss, right? So which is respect and, helpfulness, generosity, stewardship, like these kind of things, which are not often, right, measured or quantified. But I think that's also part of it where evidence-based is a really important priority. And so again, it's about what's the best form of developing that evidence, as you say, right? Because sometimes we can put it into an individual number. Sometimes it requires actual surveys and like discussions with people to get a better understanding of really what was at the root of that. But yeah, the more we're able to, I think, transform more holistic and complex ideas into indicators, I do think it'll help policymakers for sure to make more informed decisions as well. In terms of the patterns, so I think, you're alluding to, like some of the work that's really been coming from that, which has been awesome. I'll just maybe speak to one, which is we're developing this policymakers network. So we just put a call out to any government official who was interested in the wellbeing economy, invited them all there, told them a little bit about the guide, but also about the vision for the network as being a space kind of like WEAll for government officials who are passionate about this work and maybe frustrated within their own institution to be able to come together, share best practice, learn from one another about how to practically do this. The pattern I'm noticing, the most obvious one, is it's almost all women. Yeah. So we have like about 26, now maybe like 29. They come actually from a wide range of levels. So from local council to regional government, majority being from national level in the sense of ministries, different ministries of economy, infrastructure, environment, society. They all have different names, but the cool thing is very much the geographic diversity of has been quite amazing. So from all over Europe, Africa and Latin America, right? So like there's a pretty good distribution. I think there's 2 from Germany, so like a local and a national, 2 from the Netherlands, regional and national, and 2 from Scotland. Yeah, sort of a government agency and then a government body, and then all the rest are from all different countries. So that's quite cool. In terms of their actual educational background, it varies. And to be honest with you, I don't actually 100% know. I think a lot of them have studied economics in some way, maybe, but not necessarily, I guess. I don't know. But it's a good question. And I would be interested to find out a bit more from them as well.
Yeah, that will be so interesting to see how it evolves. And the gender balance is interesting. I mean, I also wonder if people will come to it thinking that well-being is more about the people than it is about the environment, and then if understanding evolves, if that would change who would kind of come to it in the first place. Would anybody else like to elaborate on something that they might have written? I'm trying to read. I mean, there are some I'm keen to move on to the I was less convinced by points, because I think they probably stimulate really interesting conversation. Who's visiting bear? Does someone want to own up to being visiting bear and maybe bring up a point? No. So we've got one point about the point about disentangling current policies that contrast with a well-being economy is vital, but also perhaps the most difficult given path dependencies. Any good examples? That's from Catherine again. On the ground examples are really useful. I think these are very helpful for policymakers to see. Definitely agree with that, and the importance, like the case studies you guys probably found as well, like really brought it to life in a way that it would have been quite difficult to understand maybe without those without the examples. Oh, someone's deleting the different things. And then we've got participation takes a lot of time, not everybody actually enjoys it. So how do we find the right balance between participation and non-participation? That's a good point. I mean, I don't know who brought it up. Feel free to shout out, but Amanda, not sure.
Yeah, I brought that up.
Was that you, Lucas? Oh, sorry, yes. You've put your hand up. Yeah,
that's okay. No, I mean, actually, I was thinking about that because, I mean, it does, like, obviously, I really like that the focus of the report is on participation, because I think it's really important. But I feel like, where do you kind of strike the balance between doing that? Because it is takes a lot of effort. So what kind of decisions do you think it's useful to do that, and what maybe it's just useful to have somebody in government deciding this is what we do? Like, for example, one of the things that's from a local example, very recently, like I live in a kind of very active community neighborhood block, and the council decided to put in new bike storage on the road, which obviously a great project. And they just basically brought in somebody to decide where they want to put it. It takes up one parking space, which again was, and basically that kind of kicked off a lot of discussion actually in the group. Like, some people were really unhappy about it, in terms of, because there might be a slightly better place, or where it might be less in the way from their view, like 100 meters down the road. And so I was just thinking that, and they were like, well, the council, it's all about community, they should have asked us, and so on and so forth. But I was thinking, if the kind of council comes every time asking, they want to place like this kind of bike storage thing, they don't have the capacity, or kind of, and I think even the people would probably start complaining that they asked about all these little things all the time. So I was wondering where you think is kind of like, how you see that kind of balance.
Yeah, I mean, it's a really, really important, and I mean, I don't have like a clear answer for you, but it's something which has come out. Actually, was speaking with a Dutch regional government that was having the same challenge, right? They're like, at what points, like, is it really important to have deliberative discussions? And at which points, like, when is it legitimate, right, for, let's say, a group of experts, or for individual policymakers, or et cetera, you know, as representatives, to to make those decisions for people. And I think it's also something we're realizing is there is a challenge in the United States, for example. A lot of people are fatigued with participation because it's very token, right? Like you can be asked, but ultimately, what difference does it make, kind of, and so I think it's also about a transformation of sort of, again, that sort of bottom up, where who realized that they needed a new part, like a bike rack? Yeah, like who wanted that? Yeah, and so how can we empower them, right, to determine in some way where they think it would be best, and then on that basis, how can the state or the government then use the sort of legal or rights or incentives or money or funds or whatever it is to sort of make that happen in some way, right? And so I think that's sort of part of the logic, where it's not so much we want to do this, let's go ask people what they think. It's the swapping that. It's like people want this, right? And so then the policymakers are then meant to make that happen, if that makes sense. You know what I mean? And so I feel like there is obviously a really tricky balance with that, even with developing the guide, right? So I tried to use really participatory processes and a variety of them to get the members involved, but ultimately there's certain amounts that you take a lot of ideas and you have to make sense out of them. And so how do you do that also in a way that is going to be representative of a lot of different kinds of diversity of perspectives and experiences? So I think that's maybe the interim, is that it's not just that, you have a lot of deliberative discussions and then one or a couple people in government then make that happen, but it's you have that, and then maybe you have a strategic group, a diverse group that then sort of takes that and makes sense out of it, and then the government then works in service of that strategy or that policy or those ideas. I don't know. I mean, the Dedicem Barcelona example is one that really makes me excited, because it's a digital platform, but the level of engagement that they've experienced by people is actually quite astronomical, because people see any of their policy proposals, they get to debate with each other on it, refine it, do whatever, and then they're immediately passed, right? And so when they see that their ideas are actually being implemented, the amount that people really want to engage increases a lot as well. And so, I think that challenge of making it clear that this isn't going to be token, it's going to be meaningful, which is a big shift from the beginning.
Do you think, it's part of the challenge is that people just feel time poor to actually participate, because you've already got to have a certain level of privilege, right? By the time you're sitting down to go on your laptop to think about policies that you care about in the neighborhood, you've clearly got time and therefore potentially money or access to childcare or whatever it is,
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I mean, particularly in the United States, I just came back after being abroad for a long time. Time poverty is real. Yeah, people really don't have time, and it has the same effect on our brains. It's starvation, right? It actually does. And so, yeah, I mean, I think that's why this first thing around identifying what really matters for well-being. Again, people talk about civic engagement, right? And maybe that's political participation, but it's also just engagement with one another, right? Engaging as a community and feeling like you're supporting one another and making decisions together and having time for family and friends to discuss as people and all of that, and recognizing that intersection with when they say they also need work-life balance, right? And they also need time for their families. And, so you bring in all of these various priorities together in some way that makes sense for a different vision of how we live together, and how we spend our time together. Because right now, it's all we're just meant to work all the time. Yeah, that's meant to be the major thing we do all the time, despite made all this money and it'll never stop.
Gary, you put a really interesting comment in the chat about using developmental evaluation. I, for one, have never heard of that, so I wonder if there are other people in that situation, but would love to hear a bit more about that.
Sure.
Thanks for joining from Australia as well.
Yeah, I was just awake and got the email. I'd forgotten I'd actually registered for this. So I work for a community development organisation in the Western Desert, and in this cross-cultural space, I kind of, the one thing you're always certain of is uncertainty, that you don't know quite what's going to work and what isn't, nor why. You don't know what your failures and successes are going to be. So in order to have accountability to people on the ground, to the model communities we work with, as well as to, I guess, to funders who, need some rigor to their account, and some structures that provide rigor. We use something called developmental evaluation, which basically acknowledges that your program logic at the outset isn't always going to foresee everything that happens. There are just going to be successes and failures, and these aspects that are really, really valuable of what you're doing that wouldn't be measured by just regular boxes that you tick. In your program logic. So you need to be able to adapt. You need to be able to adapt to the goals that you aren't hitting, as well as really take stock of, the real benefit, and maybe adapt and say, all right, well, it wasn't exactly what we were trying to accomplish, but this is really, really valuable anyway. Let's keep doing this. And basically developmental evaluation, it's particularly useful in those kind of startup and community development contexts where there is a lot of uncertainty going on. And you have these rigorous kind of evaluations sessions after every kind of major event, or kind of just periodically during a project, to take stock of where you're going. And you normally have an external evaluator who's been there for the life of the project, who's kind of a part of that journey as well.
So is the idea that it's that you want to do more ongoing evaluation, or kind of less thorough evaluation but more frequently, almost like you kind of touched on the idea of like a startup, how it it kind of does little sprints and then takes stock, and then does other little sprints and takes stocks, so that it really molds to the environment.
I think the main one is being able to adapt, not being stuck ticking a bunch of boxes that, you're ticking them in order to get more funding, in order to tick more silly boxes. It's that you can actually adapt your boxes to the successes that the community requires.
Mm-hmm. That's really cool, Gary. I like that a lot. If you have any good tools on that, will you share it with me? Because I think it'd be nice to add it to the sort of assessments and evaluation sort of tools and things. Because it is, I don't know, I think about this sometimes as we're in a bit of the paradigm shift we're having is moving away from really mechanistic, linear intervention logic kind of systems to much more fluid, emergent, interconnected, complex, sort of ways of thinking, and so it's really cool when there's new tools and approaches that really embrace that and make it practically easy for policymakers or project manager communities to operationalize that.
No, 100%. So before we kind of move on to more free flow conversation, would anyone like to raise something that they've written? I mean, there's loads here that we've not covered. So yeah, please do shout out if you'd like to elaborate, or kind of, share a prompt, especially people who haven't spoken yet. We've got Wani, Lan, Aruvi, Donya. Not sure if you're multitasking and enjoying listening, or if you'd like to share something. Or Maeve as well.
Yeah, Maeve, what do you think?
Well, I'm not an expert on the policy side of things. I thought it was really interesting what Catherine said earlier about the kinds of knowledge that we prioritize and how we talk about data. It's something that I had never thought about. I'd never thought about how do you quantify certain things like lived experience, because that's something that is lived experience is what the wellbeing economy is about. But how do you actually, what are the ways that you measure that? How do you measure happiness? How do you measure time poverty? I mean, actually you can measure that, but how do you measure the actual ways that our structures affect our happiness? I mean, there's I know that there's a lot of different indicators out there, but that's one of the things I find most interesting in the conversations around wellbeing economy. I don't know.
Yeah, for sure. One thing, I mean, I definitely have a problem, or not, well, to some extent, a problem with the idea of happiness.
Oh
Because
yeah.
I think philosophers talk more about fulfillment, and there's this kind of idea that you could be a happy human in a vat being controlled by some robot, but like, is that actually a meaningful life? So I kind of like steering clear of
I guess
happiness.
dignity is probably a better measure of what we're talking about when we talk about a well-being economy.
Yeah.
Yeah, it is. I mean, and it's also, I mean, the issue as well is how do we not only quantify, right, but also recognize intersections, like by quantifying, not essentializing things as separate from one another, right? Because everything is relational to other things and has intersections with other things, and so that's also, I think, where we're starting to develop new ways of conceptualizing of evidence and thinking about systems. And yeah, so there is a lot of different approaches, obviously, and some are basic, just like indicators, but also going out and talking with people is also evidence. It's qualitative evidence, and it can inform oftentimes a lot more in terms of understanding whys, not just what.
No, definitely. So we've got just short of half an hour left. So I think if anybody has any specific questions, perhaps not to do with what's on this board, then feel free to start putting them in a chat, and I'll probably just kickstart with a couple for Amanda. So I think you've had a really interesting career in that you did your master's at Cambridge, and then you went and worked at the UN or the World Bank, and then the African Development Bank, and then you've ended up at WEAll. So I think it would probably be really interesting for everyone to hear a little bit about that journey and what you found so problematic in the places you worked, and how that played its part in you being where you are now.
Yeah, for sure. So first of all, maybe to explain, I'm from a really small town in Vermont where like small, rural, we still have a town meeting. I don't know if you know about this, but we don't have like a formal government. It's like in March, the town comes together and we sit in this like big hall and debate how much money is going to go to the roads and how much is going to go to schools and who's going to be the constable and catch dogs that year and this sort of stuff, right? So it's really like very participatory, Rousseauian kind of like democratic process. So for me growing up, that was my introduction to politics and economics. So you can imagine when I went to university and studied economics, I was like, what is even going on? Like they assume that economics is not affected by politics or culture or history or anything. Like this is insane. Yeah, I couldn't understand like that sort of logic. So from the beginning was very much leaned more towards heterodox economics stuff and more political economy. Sort of graduated being clear that I wanted to, like neoliberalism was the worst, but not really knowing what to do about it, I guess. And then I worked in like India and Indonesia more on labor rights stuff and more like civil society work. And I was really drawn to, I read this paper by Ha-Joon Chang. I don't know if you have read anything. Have you done a WEAll Reads on one of his books?
We've done 23 things they don't tell you about capitalism.
Nice.
Yeah.
So when I was in university, I read this paper by him, which is called Breaking the Mold. And it was a short sort of article on why the idea of the free market just doesn't exist, because it's always going to be a construct of sort of what's acceptable behavior or not. So, in some places, the idea of banning child labor is not viewed as an infringement on the market, right? Because it's just an acceptable thing that shouldn't be working, right? But then in other places, like that would, you know what I mean? That's part of the way that like people provide for one another. And so, yeah, like these sort of things are sort of culturally dependent, historically dependent. I really loved it. And so I reached out to him and I decided to go to Cambridge, as I said, and he's really into industrial policy. So for him, coming from South Korea and seeing the incredible development of his country economically due to more interventionist kind of policies to protect and promote certain industries, particularly in manufacturing, was really important to him. And his vision for how we can develop, reduce the imbalances in the world. And so for me, I got really into industrial policy as the idea that that was maybe the remaining space where the government was allowed to intervene, like mess with the free market kind of, because all of the other economic policy spaces, like the ideas you just support free trade and, you know, big investors and all of these things. And so that led me to UNIDO, which is the UN's Industrial Development Organization. And I started to do policy advisory with governments, and being young and naive, I was like, okay, it's just an issue of different trade and economic policies. And these countries are gonna like transform their economies and all of this. And then I got there and I realized most of these governments don't write their own policies. Yeah, so it's McKinsey, it's the World Bank, it's the UN, it's these external consultants who come in and they write these really fancy, beautiful policy documents that cost a couple $1 million. And at best, it sits on a shelf somewhere and nobody ever looks at it again. And at worst, they actually try to implement stuff that they didn't really engage in developing and that they don't understand. And it normally is not in their law, like in their interest. It's in the interest of, you know, external multinationals or whatever. And so I was like, okay, let's take a step back, because the first thing we need is for them to own these policies, right? For them to be aligned with their context and what they think is important. So I started to work with colleagues a lot more on like policy facilitation, policy training, and like capacity development kind of work in the area of industrial policy. Like, so this is where I mentioned like doing your own data analysis to understand what's going on in your sectors related to the environment or society or like economic performance, and how do you facilitate sort of goal-oriented processes of developing strategies and policies. And I think that informed a lot of coming into this particular project, where I was actually originally asked to develop a just transition guide. And I was like, well, there's a lot of just transition guides. So why don't we do a guide on how we transition from the current economic system to a well-being economic system, which, you know, it's an impossible task because we haven't done it, but, you know, make it seem possible, right? Illustrate, there's some good examples out there. And I think that's, for me, why the focus on the how, as opposed to the what, like that experience working with governments felt really important, right? Like, because that's what is needed a lot more than saying you should be doing this. These are the policies you need. This is how you should measure well-being. To say, okay, how do you go about figuring out that for yourself so it's owned and contextual?
Amazing. There's so much in there. I mean, and there's so much in the guide. That's what's so interesting, right? Is that you know, you said this isn't a guide about how to do it, because, you know, everyone, it's going to be different for everyone, but it's about, it's a guide to help you work out how to do it. And I think, you know, normally we read a book for these discussions, and I thought, oh, it's only a guide, it's only 30 pages or whatever it is. And then you get into it and I was like, oh my goodness, there's so much here. How do I digest this? So I'm not sure if anyone else felt that, but especially it was totally new to me when you said that governments often don't design policies themselves, and you becoming quite disillusioned with that. I mean, I had no idea that, especially like big private sector, or what I perceived as being big private sector consultancies like McKinsey or Bain or whoever are writing policies, especially for, well, yeah, when countries really should be understanding what they're doing themselves. Yeah, does anyone want to add to that point or elaborate on it? Any follow-up thoughts? Yeah, Laura.
Can you hear me okay? Yeah, really just to second the sentiment that, my goodness, I don't think it's ever taken me so long to read 30 pages just because every section required me then thinking. I work in a think tank in Brussels, so properly in the EU bubble, trying to push this approach to policymaking in Brussels. And wondering how on earth I can condense this down further to sort of fill a 2-hour at most webinar. But yeah, I mean, it's a brilliant guide. I have no idea how on earth you put it together, but kudos for managing to put something down on paper.
Awesome. Yeah, and I think what's so cool as well is that we again, at WEAll, we try and make it quite actionable. So kind of doing takeaways at the end, thinking, okay, what am I going to do now? And this was the perfect resource for that. So Amanda, maybe you can now, tell us a bit more about the Policymakers Network and what's happening now that the guide is done to try and put it into practice.
Yeah, so it's quite exciting actually, because the funder who helped fund for this, like development of the guide, is also helping to fund for the rollout of it in 4 different countries. So it's really neat, you know what I mean? It's like, there's no point in just having like another PDF, like trying to tell policymakers what to do, right? It's like really like the exciting bit is when you actually try to see this in action and what this means in practice in different locations with different priorities and, you know, different contexts. And so we're doing a rollout in with like communities in California, Canada, Scotland, and New Zealand. So sort of simultaneously with different kind of approaches, taking different aspects of the guide and, you know, seeing how through that experience, right, we can hopefully, the thing I'm trying to really emphasize them is I'm most interested in the hard bits, right? So like they can't figure out how do we craft this email for an invitation for this sort of thing, right? It's like that in and of itself is really going to be helpful for someone, right? So like, how do we get examples of those kind of invitations and the questions that they end up asking and the challenges in California with, you know, getting people to buy into participating in something when it's been so tokenized for so long. And, you know, like those tough things that can be more concrete supplements for action. Because there's so much that's like missing, right? Within this, but also that really grounds it some more, and then also to have some real life case studies that we can share with the world to illustrate that these sort of changes are happening. And so that's really exciting. And then we have the Policymakers Network, which I sort of just started with another, I created this drafting team, which is just put a call out to the membership to see if anybody wanted to engage in this, and overwhelmed. I just started this job. I got like over 50 people who responded, and I had one-to-one calls with each of them to sort of understand what their deal was and like how much they want to engage and in what way. And so I created these different sort of concentric circles of engagement. And the drafting team was this group of 7 amazing people. And one of them was Jacob he runs a think tank called Zoe, like Future Fit Economies. And so we decided to start this Policymakers Network. And what they're doing, I mean, the nice thing is that this isn't actually funded, so we can really just do whatever we want with it. And so we've been very clear that like this is their space for policymakers, that it's only for policymakers just because like people actively working in government right now, just so they feel like it's safe to talk about challenges and failures and things like this with one another in a way that they won't feel like it's gonna, you know, jeopardize whatever sort of things, but also I hope to integrate them within the larger movement as well. And so we're starting with some of these beginning questions in the guide. So we started with how do we want to work together? What do we want to achieve together? But then in September doing how do we understand what matters for well-being? And so there's a policymaker from Peru and one from the Netherlands. We're both going to present on how they've been going about it. So one used a lot of participatory approach, another one used more research-based approach, and then bring an open question or challenge that they've sort of had to the group to discuss, to deliberate on, to share. And so I'm hoping that also through this, we're going to learn a lot as well about, because there's a lot of, the guide sort of intentionally makes this look easy, right? In some ways, and it's not. There's a lot of stuff that's missing there. And there's a lot of tools that we don't have to really do this. There's a lot of open questions. And so, you know, but figuring those out in real time and having a community of support, I think is really important. And then the other thing is I really wanted to continue to engage the WEAll membership as much as possible within this. So we've created these sort of awareness raising or engagement group where the idea is there's some foundational work that needs to be done here in terms of, one, raising awareness by policymakers of the well-being economy and why it's important. So like, how do we do that? First of all, to increase the appetite worldwide for this kind of work. And two, how do we convince citizens that they need to be more engaged in economic policymaking, right? Because the terms economic and the term policy both make people feel really intimidated, right? And like they're not, like, oh, like what? And so like that sort of like, and so we're, thinking through what are strategies to really mobilize and galvanize the public to demand a different kind of approach to the way that we're governing and designing policies for our economy. And so like try to do those sort of both dual things, think about sort of practical actions the network itself can sort of take a lead on. And so, yeah, that's some of the things that have been happening. It's been quite neat actually on the basis of this that we've gotten quite a number of governments who've started to like come and ask for support with this kind of work. So I was on a call with like the Dutch government yesterday, and we've gotten some like the Finnish government and like, a lot of the ones that I think are already like, this is a kind of priority for them. But yeah, it's gonna be neat. It's gonna be cool. It's really difficult, to be honest, because institutions are strong, right? And the siloed institutions are strong. The way of doing things and the hierarchy is a little bit set. And so how do you transform that in a way that doesn't totally disrupt the like intrinsic knowledge, right, that's there? Because there's a reason for some of these practices and systems and structures, right? Like to do justice to the knowledge that's held in that, whilst also dispersing power in a way and making these decisions more inclusive and more adaptive.
There's so much in there. Thanks so much. I feel like I need to rewind and like listen to it all again.
I know. I think I went on a little bit of a tangent also. Welcome to my brain. Yeah, like I've just like went off on something.
No. It's amazing. It's amazing. Does anybody else have any questions that they would like to ask Amanda kind of before we?
I'd also really love, any other sort of reflections you have, ideas, anything that's sort of like any sort of, I don't know, whatever about it. Because it's cool to be able to meet with a group. It's like sort of reading this as a WEAll, like a reading group, right? What was that experience like also? I don't know. Sounds dense. It was dense. Yeah, I get a sense it was dense. So that's something. We tried to make it like add pictures in there, so like it wouldn't be intimidating, right? But yeah.
It's not the most dense, don't worry. I mean, Aruba, you've put a comment in the chat about being interested in it because there's a different perspective. So I guess it'd be interesting to hear, given how different it is to everything that you've read, how you found it, if you found it inspiring or kind of overwhelming or not convincing or clear, confusing. Ruby? It is quite late, so we do sometimes have some people sort of trying to do lots of different things at the same time.
Yeah.
Hey, Lucas.
I've brought a new guest. I actually thought, I just wanted to say, from in terms of the reading experience, I thought it was like, I really enjoyed reading it. Like, I think it's a guide, not a book, but the sections, how it was laid out, I think is so clear. I was really impressed by that, and having like even just the little like tools, and you just have like the names there so people know what to put into Google or something, or having the links in there. Like, I thought it was actually like, it also means you can read it just the specific bits you're interested in. So I think it's, I was really impressed. Like, it was really well done in terms of layout and writing.
Wani, do you have any final thoughts?
Hi. I think I need to go back and revisit it again to really look at it and what are the things that I can add and comment on. So that's it for me from my side at the moment.
That's okay, but thanks for joining. And I think that's why we try and do summaries at the start, because often in these readings there is a lot, so actually getting a bit of a memory jogger can be useful. Lan, what about you? Lan, are you there? No. What about Rudy? Oh. Hey Lan, do you want to share any final thoughts?
So this is just a lot to like process and to try and reflect it through what I'm doing and what I'm currently, and the policy space that I'm working in. So there's lots in the documents. So I found the document quite easy to read in a way because it articulates everything I'm already trying to do and work, like the emphasis on like values and having the focus on values and not just outcomes, and also the focus on process. And yes, I have felt that struggle of strategies just being left on the shelf and sadly gathering dust. So coming from that perspective, I do worry that while on one hand, I know that I'll never live in a utopia where we'll stop measuring things, and I'm not going to turn the tide back on like evidence-based policy, and we do therefore need better indicators. That's the way things are set up here in Scotland. It's really hard to push back that. So the things about measuring, that's what I worry, that's what people are going to like latch onto, and they're just going to switch from the current ways of measuring to more well-being measurements and not think through like what the burden of measurement is on people. So there's a lot of services I've seen and spaces I've seen where measurement is intrusive and almost dehumanizing, and young people don't think about that. They just get cited as like, it's well-being, we're trying to change it for well-being, let's go and make everybody take the Warwick scale. And I know that the document is more complex than that, but because it is, and you know, you are trying to deal with a global audience and not trying to deal with, you know, like you say, every culture is different. So the way it fits into this culture with this policy context, I would like to see like just more pushing back against that, and the things it's saying about the values, that is valued for it in itself. Maybe I'm getting back to utopia again, but some of the best projects are when somebody's given the money over and just trust, and like you say, just hanging out and working together. But although that is in there, unless it's shouted really loudly, consistently, I fear nobody's going to listen. So yes, I've just been puzzling on how to make things happen. So, but I guess that's the nature of a document that's global. There's always just things that are not going to work for some places, and not going to address issues in some places. So yeah, I guess the next thing is how what's
next? I think like one thing that's really interesting as well, Amanda, in the slideshow that you showed all the ladders going in, all of the between the different chapters, and how yes, we have to read a document from start to finish, but actually they all kind of happen iteratively at the same time, and that's really powerful. It's kind of part of appreciating that we're part of a system rather than a really linear thing that's happening, but at the same time it can make it slightly more overwhelming to think, okay, well, what actually is the sequence? And whether we're coming up to the top of the hour and a quarter, but I don't know if Hans or Isabel, if anyone else wants to kind of share a last thought before we close up.
Well, I think that I am trying to make my research is ranting a little bit against linearism and reductionism, and trying to using particular theories to make people think in that diagram, in that ladder, in that non-linear, and just embrace the fact that life is messy, and let go sometimes of reductionism. Whether anybody ever listens to me and just thinks I'm ranting yet again, maybe I'll show them that diagram next time.
Yeah, you should. You should.
Sorry.
Yeah, second that. Hans, do you want to close up, or do you have any final thoughts? Oh, you're on mute.
Yeah, okay. Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Okay. I was just dropping in something like 15 minutes ago, so I missed a lot. I'm sorry about that. But the last part, I heard something about values, and I think that's the basics of everything. And indeed, in every country is different and that kind of stuff. I'm the founder of the Business Hippie Club, and we started a movement. I'm an old business hippie, and I wrote a value manifest, and everything is based on that, in my opinion. So it's a manifest and a movement, a social economy based on human values. So instead of starting with sustainability or circularity or regeneration or whatever, I think we should, could, would start with values and build everything on top of that. That's my view, anyhow. So I want to, drop that in.
No, absolutely. Thanks so much, Hans. That's great. And I think, yeah, I mean, the guide is so powerful just by starting off with like, what's the vision, which I think so many politicians don't get around to talking about. So yeah, but Amanda, thanks so much. I know that I think you're in the middle of your day and you have other meetings to get off to, but I think a virtual round of applause, and thanks so much to Amanda for joining us. Yeah, it's been so valuable, and it's been so lovely having all of you here. And I think one of the really special things about this group is that everyone brings such different insights and expertise. We have a range of ages and yeah, just such a different range of insights. So that always makes the conversation really valuable. I'll be hanging around for a few minutes in case anyone else wants to continue the conversation, but otherwise there are a few links in the chat. So yeah, if you want to stay in touch and kind of in the loop with more events, then the best way to do that is either the WhatsApp group or just give me a follow on Twitter. And yeah, that's everything. So thanks.
Oh, well, thank you so much for having me. It was really nice to meet you all. Do you know what you're going to read next?
No, and we're actually we're going to be recruiting a comms lead. I say recruiting like a volunteer position, but finding a comms lead, which is really exciting, and thinking about doing some outreach. So over the next year, quite a lot will, well, not a lot will change, but certain things will change, which is really exciting. So yeah, if you've enjoyed it and you're keen to get involved, then like I said, join the WhatsApp group where all the chat happens.
I'm in the WhatsApp group now, so I really look forward to joining for the next WEAll Read as well, reading a book, discussing with you all. Thank you for having me.
Thank you.
A wonderful Wednesday, and I'll see you all soon.
Right, bye.